Hey everybody, Michael Park from DriveDV.com here for Creative Cow. And in this After Effects tutorial, we're going to look at recreating kind of an underwater scene with bullets tracing through. I was watching Navy SEALs the other night, you know, the one with Charlie Sheen from a long time ago. And there's a scene at the end where there's some bad guys trying to shoot the American soldiers, and they're in the water and they dive down, and there's all these bullets coming into the water from on top. They're hitting the water and kind of going everywhere with all these bubble trails. And I thought that'd be a pretty cool scene to recreate using Trapcode Particular. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Here we are in After Effects, and you can see that all I have in here right now is this bullet image. And if I double click it here, you can see it's nothing more than just a still image of a bullet, which I've gotten from Wikimedia Commons, and I've gone ahead and masked out the black on the outside, so we just have a nice clean bullet shape to use. We're going to use this as a custom particle in Particular a little later on. But the first thing we need to do is create a new composition by choosing Composition, New Composition, and we'll call this Final Comp. And I'm going to be working at a 720p resolution, 24 frames per second, just a duration of about 10 seconds for this. Let's click OK. The first thing I want to put in here is a background, and what we're going to do is create a new solid, call this BG, make it comp size, doesn't matter about the color, and we're going to add Effect, Generate, Ramp. Now we don't need something extravagant for this background, but we need it to look kind of like the ocean, and the ocean is a kind of a bluish green color on top, maybe a little more green. And as you go farther down, it changes and gets darker. So let's just go ahead and put a darker color down here, maybe a little deeper blue. Top color might be a little dark. Lighten that up a bit. Okay, and I also want to change the gradient so it's not perfectly level. Just make it a little more sideways so it's not quite as perfect. And let's also increase the ramp scatter, which will create kind of little dots in here and not be a very smooth gradient in the background. Since this is kind of a more organic scene and not a kind of man-made clean background, we want it to be a little more jittery, which is what this does. That's fine, I think it looks good. Next, let's go ahead and start making our bullets and trails. So let's choose Layer, New Solid, and we'll call this Particular Bullets. Make sure it's comp size and click OK. To this, let's add Effect, Trapcode Particular. Now I'm using Particular 2.0, and the reason why is, number one, I have it, and number two, one of the things we're going to take advantage of in Particular 2.0 under the particle settings is this new dialog box called Rotation. And if we come down here, oh, it's grayed out right now because we have it set to sphere. But if we turn this to something like a sprite, you can see we have this rotation, and we have this new feature called Orient to Motion. And this is a great feature that Particular 2.0 has in it, and we'll be utilizing that in a second. Let's go ahead and set our emitter settings up first, and then we'll worry about our particle. Let's twirl this back to sphere so that we can actually see our particles. And let's twirl down the emitter settings, and I want this to come from a point kind of up above here to the left, or right I guess, and be coming down here through our scene. So let's zoom out so we can see the corner a little bit better, and let's first of all change our direction from uniform to directional. And now all of our particles go kind of towards the back here, and let's change that by adjusting the X rotation to -90. So now all the particles are shooting straight downward. And then adjust our Y rotation over till they come at an angle here, maybe -50. Looks pretty good. And now we can basically take our position emitter and pop it up here in the corner off screen. And let's go ahead and adjust some of the settings. The velocity here is pretty low for bullets. It's by default set to 100. We want to put that up fairly significant. Let's put about 6,000 on that. So now the particles come shooting through the screen. We also don't need this many particles. I mean, unless you're getting attacked by an entire army at once, that's a little overkill. So let's drop that down to about 3 particles per second. can zoom back in here to see a little bit better. And as you see, we've got these particles kind of shooting through. The next thing I want to do is address the velocity of this again a little bit differently. If something comes through water, there's a fair amount of resistance through water. And we want to simulate that using the physics dialog box down here. And we're set to air, which is what we want. But what we're going to do is twirl down the air dialog box here. And if you can see, you have this air resistance feature here. And if we turn this up, what it basically does is slows down the particle over time as if they're going through something with a good amount of resistance. So if we turn it up to 3 here, you can see that the particles actually slow down as they traverse across our scene, which kind of, like I said, simulates the resistance that you would get inside of a fluid or something else, and it just makes it a little more realistic. And hey, that's what we're going for, right? Okay, so we have our air resistance turned up, and one last thing I want to do with the physics is I want to increase the spin amplitude. And what we want to do is make these particles, instead of coming in a straight line, kind of veer off to the left or to the right or forward or back, just to create a little more of a random motion, because when bullets hit water, they kind of refract through the water, and depending on how they hit and the angle and the air and stuff like that, the spin of the bullet, they'll just kind of randomly go out in different directions. So I'm going to increase the spin amplitude here up fairly big. About 700 I think will do good. And if we scrub through the timeline, you can see that the particles are starting to kind of curve and veer, which is what we want. Alright, let's go back up here to the particle settings and let's adjust a couple things. First of all, we don't need these particles to be on for 3 seconds. It doesn't really matter with these main particles, but we're going to add auxiliary particles later, and we just don't need the overhead of all the bubbles or all the auxiliary trail particles if they're not necessary. So let's bump this down to maybe 1 second. That should be plenty of time for our particles to get through our scene, but not enough time to where we have to deal with a whole lot of extra particles. Now we want to change our particle type from sphere to sprite. And the reason I'm using sprite and not a textured polygon is a sprite basically allows you to use a texture from your composition. We'll be using the bullet PNG. I'm just going to turn that off. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't rotate the particular layer in 3D space. So it always makes sure that the particle faces the camera. So if you're using a flat plane to describe or show kind of a 3D object, you want to make sure you use a sprite, as long as you're not using like some flat image or a piece of paper or confetti or something like that, where you might want it to rotate or tumble over time. Now let's go ahead and, like I said, down in this rotation tab here, turn on our orient to motion. I guess we better put our texture in here first. Got carried away. Let's change the layer from none to the bullet PNG I just tossed in. And as you can see here, we got one. Let's turn this size way up so that we can see the orientation of it. So let's just push that up. And as you can see, we got this bullet. Right now it's kind of facing one way, not really going along the motion or the path that it's traveling. But if we come up here to the rotation and turn orient to motion to on, you can see the particles automatically orient towards the direction of their travel and continuously do that as they veer, which is great. Two things we need to do. First of all, we need to color correct this a little bit. It's a little overly bright, and it doesn't have any of the C color in it. So instead of trying to do that on this layer, I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose our source footage here by choosing Layer, Pre-Compose. I'm going to leave all the attributes in the final comp and open the new composition. Click OK. And so now we have just our image here. And to this, let's add Effect, Color Correction, Curves. What we want to do is hop down here into the red channel and pull out the red, because when it's in seawater, it's going to be this kind of green-blue color, and that's what we want to simulate. So we pulled that down. If you think it's overly green, we can pull the green channel down just a little bit. Just kind of blues it out a bit. I think it's a little overly bright too, so what we can do is come in here, and the highlights would not be that bright. I'm just going to pull that down about a quarter, and if you want to darken it up even more, you can adjust the curves here. I think that looks pretty good. If we hop back in our final comp, you can see it's updated in real time. Another thing that kind of has happened is the bright part of this bullet is on the bottom, and that looks a little strange. So what we can do is once again come to our pre-comp and hit scale, and if we unlink our scale, we can flip this vertically by changing the Y parameter from 100 to -100, and that'll simply flip the bullet. So when we rotate this down basically like 180 degrees, that bright portion will be on the top, which I think looks a little more realistic. Very good. Now let's go ahead and turn that particle size down to something that I think looks a little bit more realistic for our scene. It's a little big. Maybe 40 looks good. We can adjust this later on if we need to. But we have all of our particles kind of flying through our scene here. Now that looks pretty good. So next we need to turn to our bubbles. And for that, we're going to come down here to the auxiliary settings, twirl those down, and change the emit from off to continuously. Now by default, this will emit particles from our main particles using the same particle type, which we have a bunch of these little bullets. If we increase the size of those, you can see all these little bullets being emitted. Not realistic. So let's change that type from same as main to sphere. Now we have these spheres being emitted behind our bullets, and unless you're in the 60s or 70s, this is probably not what you want. So let's go ahead and turn that size back down a little bit, and let's go down here to the color, and let's grab the color over life, and we want to change that. By default, it's set up to this kind of rainbow gradient. Let's just make this all white. So we have a nice white color here, and that will look good. The next thing we want to do is add in a little bit of velocity here, because the particles kind of just pop on and stay where they are. So let's increase the velocity of our auxiliary particles from 0 to about 90. This way they'll have a little bit of independent motion on their own, just to start breaking up the pattern a bit. I also think we need a whole lot more particles per bullet here. I mean, we are making trails. So let's increase the particles per second. By default it's set at 10, but let's bump that up to maybe about 5,000 particles per second per main bullet. So now we have these nice trails shooting behind our bullets. Still not super realistic yet, so let's go ahead and adjust some more settings. First of all, the life of this particle is set fairly low, and we want these bullets to come on or come into our scene and emit these particles and have these bubbles kind of float to the top slowly. So we need them on a little bit longer. Let's increase the life from 0.5 to 3, and now these auxiliary bubbles will stay on a lot longer. We also need to bring them down quite a bit, way too big. Maybe 3 looks good, and we also want to add a little randomness to the size of these things. So if we rotate or come down here to the randomness setting of the auxiliary particles, we can randomize the size maybe about 30% or so. If we scrub through a timeline, these particles are still popping off. I want them to stay on for a lot longer, so let's go ahead and change that 3. On second thought, we'll put it up to 10. Things are looking okay, but bubbles float upward, and right now they're just kind of coming in with our bullets and spreading out. Not realistic. One of the great things about having Particular 2 and some of these auxiliary settings is we have an independent slider here for gravity in our auxiliary particles. If we increase the gravity, obviously things will start sinking, but if we decrease the gravity and go negative, they'll start floating upward. And we can vary this to whatever we want to make it look like the bubbles are floating upwards. I think -200 looks good for us, but just as in the main particles, the bubbles wouldn't be floating up at the same velocity. There'd be a little bit of resistance, so we can take care of that by twirling down the physics properties of our auxiliary particles here, which are also independent, and increase the air resistance. And this time I'm going to bump this up to maybe, let's see what this looks like. 2 might be a little bit much. Let's try 1.5. And I think that looks pretty good. I also want to increase the randomness of these trails. They're a little bit too uniform. So let's let the turbulence affect their position a bit. And if we twirl this up, you can see the effect it has on our bubbles. I think that's a little too much randomness there. So we can dial this back to a setting that looks good for us. See, 150. and I think 150 looks good. It might be a little too much, but we can always dial that back later. And the particles are a little overly bright, so let's come to the opacity. By default, it's set to 50%. Let's dial this back until we get a look that we like. I'm going to push this back to about 15%. I think it blends in a lot nicer with our scene. Picks up a lot of the background color through our particles. And as a final thing to do with the bubbles here, I want them to have a little bit of inherited velocity from our bubbles. So almost like they're being pushed down through the water by the shell itself. So what we can do is come here to the control from main particles and the auxiliary settings and twirl that down. And here you have some different settings. What we're interested in is the inherent velocity setting. So if we increase the inherent velocity, the bubbles will have a little more downward movement, mimicking the movement of the bullet itself, and then gravity will take over and start pushing them towards the top. So let's just pump this up a little bit. That's far too much. A little dab will do you on this. Let's try something along the lines of maybe 3. Not too much, but just you can see the bubbles still kind of push downwards and then start floating up. Alright, let's turn on some motion blur. So let's twirl down the rendering dialog box and twirl down the motion blur. And by default it's set to camera or comp settings. Let's turn this to on. And the default is 360 degree shutter angle. And that's probably fine for now. We can increase this or decrease it later on, if we need to. But before we do that, I want to add in a camera and turn on some depth of field. So let's go ahead and choose Layer, New, Camera. We'll make it a 50mm preset and click OK. And I also want to add Layer, New, Null Object. And what we're going to do is make this null object a 3D layer. Let's rename this Camera Control. And let's parent the camera to it. What I want to do is create a camera move through our bullets here to make just a little more interesting scene. Let's come back here to frame 0, hit P to reveal the position of our null object, and left click the stopwatch to set a keyframe. Then let's go down 10 seconds and let's push this forward in Z space so that we kind of fly through our bubbles here. There we go, 1200. And let's select both of our keyframes and either hit F9 or you can right click and choose Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. Now that'll smooth out our camera move. Let's also twirl down our camera settings here, twirl down the camera options, and let's turn on depth of field. What this will do is create a nice shallow depth of field, so things in the background and in the extreme foreground will be blurred out, and things where our focus distance is set will be in focus. Let's increase the aperture to exaggerate this effect a bit to 100, and let's increase the blur level to something like 300 for now. The bubbles may be a little overly bright for now, but let's go ahead and adjust a couple other settings before we change that if necessary. In the ocean, you've got a lot of little particles being suspended. There's little small air bubbles, there's little pieces of debris and stuff like that, and we want to simulate that. So let's choose Layer, New Solid, and I'm going to call this Flux. I'm not sure what the technical term for it is, but that's what we'll go with. Make it a comp size and click OK. And to this, let's add Effect Trapcode Particular. And what we want to do is just create a really big box of these particles in the middle that are just kind of randomly floating around. So to speed things up, let's solo this layer and let's twirl down the emitter settings, and instead of point, let's use a box. Let's make this a really big box with settings of about 2000 in the X, 2000 in the Y, and 2000 in the Z. Let's come down here to frame 0 and let's set a keyframe for the particles per second. I want all the particles to come on in the first frame and then no more particles being emitted. So we need to increase this number up something pretty big, maybe 400,000 will do nicely. And hit page down to go down one frame. You have all these particles being emitted. Let's take this down to 0 so no more particles are emitted. And let's come down here to the velocity and turn this down to 10. And let's also decrease the velocity random to 10. I want these kind of floating, moving a little bit, but not too much. Let's twirl down the particle settings here. And we want to increase the life from 3 to maybe 15 so they stay on through the entire composition. We want to decrease the size from 5 down to about 1. So we don't want a lot of big size of these things. I also want to change the color of these to match the background a little bit better. So let's basically take and pick a color in the background, and then we can just simply stay in that family and brighten it up a little bit. And this way you've got the same color that's going on in your background, but just not quite as bright. And we can turn the opacity down so we can see through a little bit better, just to create some visual interest in our scene. We don't want this to be, really in your face, just really nice and subtle. I also want to create a little randomness in the color of this, and that's real easy to do with this color random slider. Now if you turn it all the way up to 100, you're going to get kind of a circus of colors: blue, green, red, purple, all that stuff. But if we turn it up just a little bit, it'll create a slight variation in the color, which will add to a little more visual interest in our scene. Now let's unsolo these layers and kind of take a look at what this looks like. Not too bad. One of the things I dislike though is the bullets are very, very elongated, and that has to do with the motion blur of our particles. And I want kind of more motion blur on the bubbles and less on the bullets. Now there's no way to independently control the motion blur of the auxiliary particles, which are our bubbles, with the bullets, which are our main particles. One way that we can do this though is basically to take our particular bullets and duplicate it by hitting Control D, and let's rename the top one Bubbles. Now it's just a simple matter of coming in here to the bubbles and turning the size of the main particles down to 0, leaving all the rest of the settings the same. So let's just turn this down to 0. Now if we solo that layer, you can see that we have the bubbles but no particles. Let's also come in here to the particular bullets, and we can turn off the main particles in this. Turn off the auxiliary particles. So let's turn it off, and now we have just the bullets. So now let's go down to the bullets motion blur and decrease the shutter angle down to about 10. Maybe a little more. We want it a little bit blurred out, but not too much. We want to still see or recognize the shape of the bullet. 40 looks good. And let's come to the bubbles here and turn those on. And let's come down to the motion blur on that, and let's turn that up to maybe 900. So those are nice and blurred out. And that way we can independently control both of the motion blurs to create the look that we want. And as one final step to add maybe just a hint more of visual interest, let's create a vignette by choosing Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Let's grab the circular or ellipse tool here and double click to create a circular mask. And to this layer, let's add Effect, Color Correction, and I'm just going to go with a simple exposure here. I'm going to turn this exposure down to darken it up a little bit. And let's come down here to the mask properties and click Inverted, and hit F to reveal the feather properties and feather this mask out, quite a bit. Also making sure we rename this so we know what it is as Vignette. And after a final render, here's what we get. We got these bullets flying through the scene, nice bubbles being emitted from behind them, got a nice camera move pushing through this kind of murky ocean. The project file is available on the website creativecow.net where you're viewing this tutorial, so you can go ahead and download the entire finished composition and play with the settings as much as you like. If you have any questions or comments, you can post them in the comment section of this tutorial, or if you have a specific question for me about this tutorial or anything Trapcode related, especially particular, you can find me hosting the Trapcode forum here at creativecow.net. Well, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a few new things. And as always, thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Michael Park from drivedv.com for creativecow.net.